I think we are all here now. There are 82 people in the room. That's wonderful. Just for you to know, we are recording this session. So if you don't want to show your face, that's fine. We really appreciate if you leave your camera open. We are also broadcasting this on YouTube. So thanks a lot for being here, everyone. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Roberto, and welcome everyone. Again, from wherever in the world you are, we know that there are people from so many different countries, which is super nice. So I'm Caroline Newton. I'm from the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, and I'm also teaching at the KU Leuven in Belgium. At the moment, I'm in my home. You can't see it because I have this nice background, but I'm in the city of Antwerp in Belgium. And so welcome to this final workshop in the Manifesto for the Just City. And as we have said before, these are extraordinary times. There's climate change, there are pandemics, conflict and suffering, leading to migration, growing inequality, and the erosion of democracy. So our world is facing several successive shocks. But to achieve a better world, and I believe that is possible, we also must be able to imagine it. And to imagine this better world, we need to articulate our ideas so that others can really become a part of our imagination as well. So we need better and new collective visions for the city and the communities that are just, inclusive and sustainable. And when I say we, then I'm talking about us as at TU Delft. We are the Global Urban Lab, which is a Delft platform to discuss issues of urbanization in the Global South, and we are supported by the TU Delft Global Initiative. And I think Roberto has just put the information in the chat. Shall I continue, Roberto? Or is Carolina here? You're muted, Roberto.
Sorry, Carolina is not here today.
Okay.
Could you continue?
So, yeah, sure. So we have organized this event in partnership with several schools. The Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. We normally represented by Carolina, the University of Illinois at Urban Champaign with Professor Faranath Miraftab. Welcome, Faranath. The Winston-Salem State University in North Carolina with Professor Russell Smith, and a number of universities who took up this exercise as a class exercise, notably Morgan University with Professor Christina Murphy, my university in Belgium, the KU Leuven, and also the Cape Peninsula University of Technology in South Africa. Welcome everyone from the Cape, and many other institutions and universities. So as you remember, 3 weeks ago, Professor Miraftab talked to us about the need to decolonize our minds and to seek for a just city, a just city that is life-giving rather than profit-making. Then Professor Mona Fawaz from the American University in Beirut told us about urban informality as an insurgent practice, and she reflected on the role of the state, leading us to important questions of rights and inclusion. Last week, Professor Mariana Fix from the University of Sao Paulo talked to us about financialization in the city and urban social movements in Brazil. Today, we have a very special guest, and I'm very happy and very honored that Romola Sanyal, Professor Romola Sanyal from the London School of Economics is here with us tonight, and she will talk about migration and diversity in the city. Professor Sanyal's research focuses on the relationship between forced migration and urbanization. In one strand of her research, she looks at how refugees and other forced migrants become city makers through building and inhabiting urban spaces. This work has been conducted in India and Lebanon through the study of Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut and partition refugee colonies in Calcutta. Here she explored how the act of building itself was a form of politics and how it's challenged efforts by humanitarian organizations and host governments to marginalize and depoliticize refugees. She continues this work by studying how refugees come to inhabit and make homes while being displaced and living in legally precarious circumstances. A second strand of the work looks at the geopolitics of humanitarian knowledge production, particularly on urban refugees. So the idea of tonight and of all the sessions before is that by organizing and participating in these activities, we extend mutual learning much beyond the classroom. So, and before we will give the word, the floor to Professor Sanyal, I'd like to give the word first to Roberto.
Hi, everyone. So it's really great to see how many people. I was just a few minutes ago saying, oh, maybe this session will be less attended because it's the last session, but actually there are quite a few people in the room. By the way, if you could send the link of this session to Maria. Oh, Mariana is there, so no problem. She found the link to this session. And also Professor Faranak is here, welcome. Thank you everyone for being here. We are very, very happy and honored to have Romola Sanyal today with us. Before I give the floor to her, I just wanted to tell you that in the second part of this session today, we are going to talk to the people who are going to submit a manifesto later on. And we are going to answer all your questions about how to submit, what exactly you have to submit, questions about the use of images, and so on. So please, if you want to submit a manifesto later on, don't go away. We will talk about that at the end. I just put a link. I just put a link in the chat. I am plugging in a little bit of another activity that we are organizing. It's a kind of autumn school. It was supposed to be a summer school, but it's not. It didn't happen in the summer. It's going to happen in 2 weeks. About the just transition. We already discussed in another workshop about the need to make the transition to sustainability also fair, inclusive, and just. And this autumn school is about that. It's 5 sessions of 1.5 hours, and in which we are going to talk quite technically about how to make the transition more just. At the end of the session, for those who are going to participate in the manifesto, I'm going to announce a few surprises and a few prizes for people who participate related to this as well. So hang on a minute. So this is our second manifesto for the Just City. The first manifesto was organized in November 2020 and gathered participants from 102 universities from all over the world. 172 students delivered 43 manifestos. And I'm very, very glad to tell you that there are more than 400 people, 450 people enrolled to deliver a manifesto, and there are more than 70 groups in this edition. I think it's a super nice opportunity for you to make your ideas heard. We are going to publish a book with all the manifestos that we receive. For those who haven't seen the book yet, I'm going to put the link in the chat again so that you can have a look at the book we published last year. But without further ado, I'm really grateful and honored to have Professor Romola Sanyal. And I give you the floor. Romola, please let me know. I will make you co-host so you can share your screen.
Okay, thank you so much for that very generous introduction, both Caroline and Roberto. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully I'll be able to stick to time as well. I've done well in the past, but also at the expense of speaking at a moderate pace. So if I'm speaking too fast, please tell me. Right, let me go ahead and share the screen. Okay. I'm assuming everybody can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect. Great. Okay. I'm gonna have to now find a way to get this to.
Yeah, in the
How do I? It's supposed to.
Down. There is a little
Oh.
a little square with you can.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's literally everything in my screen currently is blocked. So. Okay.
There you go.
Perfect.
Yes. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Great. Right. So I want to start again by just thanking everybody for inviting me to this really interesting set of workshops. It's a privilege to be speaking quite broadly about the questions around migration and diversity. I will note that there are a lot of different ways in which these issues are approached. So there are scholars who discuss questions around migration using ideas of conviviality, super diversity, around questions of urban citizenship, right to the city, and so on. My take on the subject is a little bit different. And I use the idea of displacement as a lens to study urbanization. So my work has, for nearly 2 decades now, focused on displaced populations in urban areas, particularly in the global south. So I've worked in the Middle East, in Lebanon, and in South Asia, in India. Roberto thought that this would be a good fit for this particular theme. I hope he's right. And so my talk today is entitled Invisible City Makers, Making Cities Just for Forced Migrants. So in this talk, I hope to do 3 things: highlight the ways in which displaced populations recraft cities, but remain invisible or hidden, bring them into conversation with irregular migrants, and end with thinking about what that means for questions of justice for them. So I'm going to start with a somewhat cliched line, which many people who work on displacement tend to use quite regularly, which is to highlight the numbers of people who are displaced globally as of today. So there are currently over 80 million people who are considered persons of concern by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or the UNHCR. And this is a UN body that is tasked with protecting refugees, forcibly displaced communities, and so on. A number of different people fall under their mandate: refugees, internally displaced people, asylum seekers, stateless populations, returnees. There's a longer history of protecting displaced people, which I will not get into at this point, but I will just note here that the current humanitarian and human rights system that we have in place today only came about in the post-World War II period, though its roots run further back in the interwar period, and the foundational values run even further back into antiquity. And again, there's some very interesting work that's been done on that as well. But in this post-war framework of protection, there's been an increasing push towards putting displaced people in designated areas, specifically in camps. And this is particularly true for refugees, who are people who've crossed international borders in search of protection. Displacement has also increasingly shifted from Europe, from where much of the framework had been derived, to the global south. And the camp itself has become a geography that is associated with the global south, although there are several scholars who note that the camp model is making its way back to Europe again today. However, despite this push for encampment as a solution to the problem of hosting displaced people, particularly for protracted periods of time, many displaced people, and one could even argue most displaced people, have not historically lived in camps, and definitely do not live in camps at the moment. They mostly live in non-camp settings, and particularly in cities. They just have not been registered, recognized, or counted. Now, there are political reasons for this, which again, I will not get into for the interest of time. But the United Nations, the UNHCR has long bowed to the pressure exerted by host governments and pushed for an encampment agenda. So it's only been since 2009 that UNHCR changed its policy to recognize urban refugees and extend protection to them. And since then, they've acknowledged that more than half the world's displaced live in cities, and that number has only grown since. So I think there's about 60+% of people who are displaced who live in urban areas. So I'm going to complicate this background a little bit more. So as I had mentioned earlier, that displacement itself occurs at a mass scale. So I had mentioned 80 million people at the start, and most of that occurs and is managed within the global South. So while the international legal framework, particularly refugee law, centers on the individual asylum seeker, in reality, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are displaced as a result of conflict and violence. These people then either come to camps or into cities. And the scale of displacement can be overwhelming for local communities, especially in poorer countries with limited resources, which host the vast majority of displaced people. And again, we've seen this in many instances. So in Lebanon, for example, there are entire municipalities in certain parts of the country that have more displaced Syrians than they do the local communities. Where there are displaced people who are living outside camps, this can then lead to tensions and conflicts between different groups of people over scarce resources, employment, and so on. There's also another important issue to note, which is an increase in protracted refugee crisis. So in other words, displacement is not resolved within months, but rather go on for years and even decades. Again, here I want to point out that the legal framework and the aid framework that underpins much of the humanitarian operations today operates with an assumption that displacement is a temporary phenomenon that will be resolved quite soon. However, as geopolitical issues around conflict, protection, and support of displaced people become more securitized and complex, the years people remain displaced become increasingly longer. So this then exacerbates the tensions, again, between host communities and displaced communities, because whatever hospitality may be extended at the onset of crises often changes or disappears as that displacement or exile becomes more extended, and host communities, who again are extremely deprived themselves in many cases, feel quite strained at hosting large numbers of people. So it's against this sort of complex and evolving backdrop that I place questions of invisibility, planning, and justice in this talk. Now, as an urban geographer and planner, I've long been interested in the ways in which cities come to be shaped through displacement, and this is where I situate my arguments. So I want to sort of shift away from the discussion of forced migrants as being victims of displacement, which is generally how they're presented within the literature, to think more carefully about how they shape their lives while being displaced and how through that they come to reshape cities. So I want to ask, why should displacement be seen as a planning justice issue? What are the relationships between the urban poor and the displaced? How do we create cities that are attentive to the complex intertwining of the two? And ultimately, I want us to think about, for whom do we plan cities and who disappears from sight and how? And hopefully I'll be able to touch some of these points through this talk. So to anchor this argument, I turn to the literature on urban refugees. Now, there is a burgeoning literature on this topic, on the urbanization of forced migrants. This work highlights the ways in which forced migrants, in the face of decades of institutional erasure, have crafted lives for themselves in cities, often informally. This is particularly the case in the global South, where again, the vast majority of refugees and other displaced people are located. The ways in which displaced people live in cities are highly contingent on a number of issues, including ethnic, local, regional, and national politics. Many cities which have witnessed significant demographic shifts due to mass arrivals and departures of people have been fundamentally, physically, and politically been reshaped. So for example, after the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, there were approximately 15 million people who were displaced. This was one of the largest displacements in modern history. Many refugees went into cities like Karachi and Lahore in Pakistan, New Delhi and Calcutta in India. Here, the sheer scale of displacement and the nature of partition itself meant that those people who were displaced were largely going to settle down in their new countries. They were not going to go back. As newly independent countries, both India and Pakistan lacked the infrastructural, financial, and bureaucratic means to address the issue in meaningful ways. Further, states like India also adopted rather different policies for different sets of displaced people. So scholars have pointed out how there was more support that was extended for refugees coming from Western Pakistan or the Punjab, rather than East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh. Refugees also so the people who came, many of them came into cities like New Delhi and Calcutta, often in the thousands per day, settling into abandoned properties and in the peripheries of cities and expanding the size of these urban areas considerably as well as their density. So in Calcutta, where I had done a significant part of my PhD research, I had been doing work on the refugee colonies that had been set up in the post-partition period. And in here, the middle-class Hindu refugees occupied and squatted on land on the fringes of the city, often in defiance of local legislation that upheld private property rights, and set about developing hundreds of refugee colonies. They built their houses out of makeshift material like bamboo and tin. They dug ponds, cleared fields, built schools and markets. So the image that I share with you here is of one of the schools that they built for themselves. This is a girls' school, as you can see. Many of the schools in Calcutta until recently were segregated by gender. But one of the things that's quite interesting also is to study the image itself and the materiality of that particular school, the tiled roof, the bamboo work that makes up the walls and so on of the school, points to the sort of precarious nature of the structure of the building itself. So they did a lot of the sort of construction of these colonies on their own, and sometimes through their own labor and through the labor of others that they were able to hire. They also displaced people themselves, often landlords who owned properties in these areas and or local Muslims who lived and worked here. They also demanded land rights by carrying out political protests, pressuring civil servants, and the like. In many cases, they succeeded, and eventually these colonies became middle-class areas. Now, there are class and caste elements to this process, and there are many other scholars who have worked on the context of Calcutta who've highlighted precisely the upper caste, particularly nature, and the middle-class nature of these squats. But as I've pointed out elsewhere, that it is still fascinating how middle class, who were once considered the middle classes, were reduced to being the urban poor and engaged in practices that we associate more with subaltern practices, so namely squatting and incremental building to claim rights to the city. They are undoubtedly city makers, as they have helped to shape the physical and political contours of the city. But in the case of the Indian subcontinent, this is indeed quite unique and wrought out of a particular moment of partition where being a refugee was politically and communally charged. And in fact, one of the things that partition scholars often talk about is how limited that particular temporal moment was. That only a few years later, the dynamics of that entire situation changed fundamentally. But this was a temporal space that enabled certain kinds of practices to emerge and flourish for a select group of people. And as I mentioned, this was quite limited. For years, even these privileged refugees occupied a marginalized space in urban society. However, these possibilities were not available to those who came later. And indeed, this episode of acquiring land and rights is also somewhat of an anomaly within a global history of urban refugees. For example, at approximately the same time, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced to Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, amongst other places, due to the creation of the State of Israel. In each of these countries, they were treated differently. So in Lebanon, although they came in large numbers, they were mostly put in camps and under tight surveillance. Some of you may be familiar with this image here. This has graced the cover of different books and pamphlets and things. This is an image of Nahr el-Barid, which is in northern Lebanon. Although they achieved a degree of autonomy when the PLO arrived in the country in 1967, the Lebanese civil war, which erupted in the country, once again set back their rights. Today, Palestinians continue to face significant discrimination in the country, being denied the right to work in a range of professions, denied the right to own or inherit property, and being compelled to live in overcrowded camps. Now, although the conditions of displaced people differ from one place to another, what is evident is that they largely lack rights and they're not considered in urban policymaking. In many countries, particularly ones that have not signed up to the Refugee Convention, where there are no national refugee laws, or which do not consider themselves countries of asylum, there are no protections for refugees and they are considered illegal immigrants. They may therefore be subject to detention and deportation and are particularly unwelcome outside camps and in urban areas. This has significant implications for their well-being. So it affects how they're able to access housing, employment, education, health, and other crucial goods and services. Now, this is also true for historical cases of India and Lebanon that I have just talked about, but also for contemporary situations, and worse now. In Thailand, for example, there are thousands of refugees, and they come from different communities, Rohingya, Vietnamese, Pakistani, so on, who are considered illegal migrants, are regularly harassed in urban areas, are subject to extortion, arrest, and detention. Because of their legal status, they're forced to work in informal jobs and have precarious access to housing and healthcare. In Lebanon, too, most of the nearly 1.5 million Syrian refugees lack legal rights in the country and are considered illegal. This means they're unable to access formal jobs or secure housing, which compounds their high levels of unemployment, and poverty. And COVID has only exacerbated these dire circumstances. Yet these displaced people continue to provide labor that makes cities function in informal, clandestine, and often precarious ways. They sell produce and other goods, they provide cleaning services, they pack and carry goods, work in construction, and often for wages that are far below that which is paid to other workers because of their ambiguous legal status. When I had been working in Lebanon, in the Palestinian camps, for example, I was once told by one of the people who I was interviewing that even though they had helped build the city of Beirut, and Shatila, where I'd been doing the field work, is now part of the suburbs of the city, they are not really allowed to occupy that city or not allowed to live there like everybody else because they can't afford it, firstly, but also because they're not allowed to sort of purchase property or live in meaningful ways outside of the camp space. Displaced people also, in many cases, as I'd mentioned earlier, face outright hostility and are subject to violence, curfews, and scapegoating by local communities. Now, humanitarian organizations are meant to extend protection to displaced people, but doing so in cities can be difficult. So Caroline Quijano and Lauren Landau talk about how local governments and planners do not prioritize displaced people. And generally, it works against them to be inclusive of them. They also note how it might be politically problematic for humanitarian organizations to provide urgent services to displaced people in visible ways, and suggest instead that they should engage in what they call stealth humanitarianism. In other words, they argue humanitarians should attempt smaller, nimbler, less conspicuous methods to extend protection to displaced people. This requires them to become locally literate and knowledgeable, and includes incentivizing local governments to include refugees as part of their broad target meeting agendas. Now, I broadly agree with them because if one has to be pragmatic, these are pragmatic solutions to issues that exist today. But what I will argue is that while such efforts can achieve reasonable outcomes on a smaller scale, they do not produce a paradigm shift or justice at a broader scale. In other words, protection is extended bureaucratically, but this can be highly contingent on political shifts, and ultimately, it does not change the hostility of host communities to displaced people. Thus, while displaced people actively participate in city making, transforming spaces through their presence and labor, they continue to either be rendered invisible and ignored or are only partially included within host societies. Now, while I have briefly outlined the ways in which displaced people transform cities politically, spatially, and socially, and how they are erased from urban policymaking, what I wish to highlight here are the parallels between the experiences of forced migrants and irregular and what the media and many politicians refer to as illegal migrants. Both, by virtue of their legal status, occupy a precarious and violent space in urban societies. These undesirables, as Michel Agier discusses them, form the lumpen proletariat. Perhaps what separates them from each other is an international protection regime, so refugee law, that idealizes certain kinds of violence and persecution, creates labels around it, and extends protection. Thus, as a recognized refugee, you may be able to avoid deportation. And again, I can talk about why that's the case under refugee law or international law. But as an irregular or illegal migrant, you don't, because you're seen to be here out of choice, not out of compulsion. And there's a very problematic distinction between the two, which again, migration scholars have long pointed out. So in this way, we create superficial, problematic hierarchies amongst the most oppressed people in the world. Now, I want to draw in planning into this discussion and ask, where is it when we consider illegality and extra-legality? Much of the literature on urban planning and policymaking, where it engages with the question of urban poverty, assumes the legality of the urban poor. It doesn't reflect on the migrant status of those living in informal settlements, their permanent temporality, and the ever-present deportability of people. Such questions are also sticky as they have to contend with the messy politics, contingent hospitality, and perhaps hostility of local communities, again, often severely deprived, marginalized, and subject to displacement and eviction themselves. Furthermore, there's another question to be asked within this sort of framework of planning, which is, how do you plan for populations that are highly transient, who are always expected to go back and never make home? So in the northern Lebanese city of Tripoli, humanitarian NGOs attempted to create solidarity and support through neighborhood level interventions, what they called the neighborhood approach. The hope being that through these local small scale upgrades and improvements, both Syrian and Lebanese communities can be supported. But the involvement of Syrian families can be highly controversial and fleeting, as they frequently move in search of work and affordable housing, and to avoid being caught by local authorities for being illegal. But the implications of such experiments can be profound for urban environments and for planning, because ultimately, what is now financing the transformation of informal poor neighborhoods is humanitarian finance, which seems to operate separately from the realms of planning and are certainly not subject to the same kinds of scrutiny by planners. Indeed, while such experiments are taking place across different crises-affected contexts, and there's a compendium of case studies of these experiments that have been taking place around different parts of the world, these are widely discussed in humanitarian literature, but they rarely enter the annals of planning studies. We may well find that as humanitarian crises and its global aid infrastructure fundamentally reshape cities and urbanism, particularly in the global South, planning will be late to catch up to this reality. So in conclusion, I want to simply just raise a couple of things. So obviously we are entering a world where in fact crises are becoming more ubiquitous, and the scale and frequency of displacement is also becoming more pronounced. So how do we plan for this world moving beyond infrastructure to think about mass displacement and centering people? What role can architecture and planning play in creating just cities for those who are forced to migrate for episodic or structural reasons? Now, usually, because I'm an urban geographer and an academic, I just sort of do a critique and walk away. But this time I thought I would actually try to do something a little bit more concrete and offer some thoughts from my end. So I'm going to suggest 3 ways forward. The first is to recognize and celebrate the migrant histories of cities. It is imperative that we educate ourselves and others that all cities have been forged through migration, clandestine or otherwise. This work is political and urgent to build much needed solidarity and to lay the groundwork for an epistemic shift in thinking amongst the public and the so-called experts of the importance of migrants, especially those who are extra-legal in transforming cities. In doing so, we may be able to shift the rhetoric from small bureaucratic changes to creating the foundations for more inclusive cities. The second is to work together with those who inhabit the margins of society, to create cities, not make cities in which they happen to exist. In other words, we plan and build with people, not for them and not without them. This requires us to recognize the importance of other life worlds, other kinds of expert knowledge, and exercise a level of humility. Decolonizing practice means that we not only learn and gain skills in our universities, but also recognize that skills and knowledge come in various ways and from various corners of the world. And it's only through collective practice that we can create something that is inclusive and just. And finally, a commitment to justice also requires us to open up dialogues with other parts of the world as equals. Too often, I have heard comments, and these are often disparaging, about how X country is unique because of Y reason. So it's usually people in a particular country saying, well, my country is special because this is how our politics work. And I want to say that every country is unique in how it experiences displacement and urbanization. But we need to move beyond these narrow, dismissive, and arguments that are often verging on xenophobic and racist attitudes, and speak to each other across regions as equals. Because specificities will always be there and are always important, but there are also global issues and structures of oppression that can only be tackled through global dialogues, through transnational conversations, and through global solidarity. So I hope I've stuck to my time, and I will end it there. Thanks.
You did. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. Zoom is so horrible because we cannot applaud and we cannot say anything. But thank you so very much, and thanks for laying out your own short manifesto for the Just City with your 3 points. And I think that's a wonderful example for the students to follow. You explained really, really well. But I'm curious to know if Caroline maybe, or the students themselves, if they have questions for Romola at this point. Bras.
Thank you, Roberto. I could have some questions, but I first want to give the opportunity to the students and the others. I think, Sidesh, you unmuted yourself, so maybe you have a question.
No, not really.
No, okay.
False alarm. Yeah. Guys, don't be afraid to ask questions. We are all friends at this point.
Yeah, I just want to. I think it was super useful in the end that you made these 3 points of how we can really move forward. Not only sort of got all the knowledge and the information, which I think was super useful to start to rethink and start to understand the complexity of migration and and what it means for urban life, but really taking it forward and see what we can, how we could work with it. And this kind of celebration of the migration histories, I think, is super crucial. And I think for all of us in the places where we live, we thank the richness of the city to that history quite often. And the point about co-creation, I think that is something, especially in design education, that we try to work with, but it's always very challenging. So that would be a question that I would have for you. How do you reach these people that are, for many different reasons, probably not very sort of jumping to participate, for example, for legal reasons and so
on? That is a good question. I might have to think about that. I mean, like I said, that it is actually very difficult to get them to participate. I mean, there have been efforts by different NGOs to get them to participate. But as I said, that very often what ends up happening is their participation is very limited for political reasons. And also because they've got other things that they have to worry about, where, you know, they're going to get money for the, you know, to put food on the table, particularly in this COVID situation. And also because they keep moving from one place to another. There are many, ultimately, when you look at the case studies from many countries, whether it's Thailand or India or Lebanon or different places, the survival of many of these people is you know, dependent on, or rather a lot of civil society organizations support them quite a bit, and they help them access the urgent care that they need and so forth. And I feel like engaging with the organizations on the ground who work with these organizations, with these people, and many of the displaced people themselves have organizations as well, and working with them is one way to begin to build those dialogues with them. I think beyond that, it would be highly speculative of me, because a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is very much with the humanitarian organizations who have a very top-down view, and that makes me highly cynical. But partly I also said that because of my experience from South Asia, where people have very clear ideas of what they want and what their needs are, and how things that are provided to them are not what they need. And so it's really important that we recognize that and recognize that they bring skills with them. Why would we design for them? Why would we plan for them instead of, you know, working with them as equals? Is something very, this is something really disturbing about that for me. But that doesn't answer your question, Caroline, but except to say, I don't know. Start with the local organizations that work with the people and see what they would say would be the best way to engage with people.
Thank you very much, Romola.
So the questions are coming in the chat, and Viraj, you sent a question just to me, but would you like to read your question?
Yes. So,
Viraj.
He sent it to you. Okay.
I don't see this person coming in. I will read the question for you.
Okay.
Question to Romola, ma'am. How do you think the government and other private organizations can help in tackling reverse migration, which happened during the pandemic? I guess this is an acute problem, especially in India, isn't it?
Yes. Gosh, this is an interesting question. There are organizations that have been trying to tackle this on the ground. in India, it's a little bit tricky to answer this question without getting tangled into webs of controversy. But for starters, I would say perhaps, not introducing lockdowns with 3 hours or 4 hours left for people to sort out their lives would be a start. Because that automatically creates a crisis situation that is completely manufactured. All crises are manufactured, but this is of a scale that's unprecedented and is completely unnecessary. And it impacts the people who are the most vulnerable in quite profound ways. I think the state, in this case, needs to respect people who are poor. I think that is, for me, the underlying issue is there's a complete lack of respecting the humanity of informal workers in cities, as if they're simply there to just be dispensed with when there's a crisis. And I think, again, it comes back to this issue of shifting the mindset. We need to work on shifting the mindset and getting all of us to recognize the humanity of people and treating them with a degree of respect that they lack at the moment. So I think that's probably where I would start. I mean, I think the state needs to start there by recognizing that. And the policies would have to flow from that ideology, not from the ideology that people are dispensable if they belong to a different class. NGOs in India have been working to address some of these issues. In fact, I'm working with one of them at the moment, precisely on this question of return migration and trying to manage that particular question. There's a massive amount of disinformation and excess information that occurs, certainly in the Indian context, and that's sort of one of the things that we're working on. There are migration facilitation centers that are being set up by certain organizations to help migrants, manage these journeys in less exploited ways. But again, NGOs, again, in India have also faced a series of setbacks over the years because of different kinds of legislation and so on. And so again, that's something that needs to be addressed. How much autonomy do they have to address some of these issues? In the Indian context, also civil society actors have been quite active. That's been one of the most incredible things about watching the response to the pandemic. And the return migration has been the work of the civil society organizations coming out to feed and support people. But something structural needs to happen because these things are fleeting. They happen, when there's a crisis, people will step in. But we need to move beyond this kind of crisis mindset and think about what is the bigger issue here? What is the bigger critical issue here? The bigger issue for me is, why do we treat the vast majority of people in this country as if they're dispensable? That is, for me, the foundational question. So until that's addressed, I'm not sure whether, many of the sort of Band-Aid solutions can work.
If only people would stop blaming the poor for their own poverty, I think we would advance quite quickly. Before I give the word to Eugene, I think Sidesh has finally decided to make a question. Because you have your hand up, Sidesh.
Yes. So I had a question regarding. So we were talking about forced migrations, right? So those could include like Rohingyas to Delhi. But I wanted to ask you about what about people who are forced by economic conditions to move? Like there are Bihari migrants to Mumbai. There are violence against Bihari migrants. At the same time, in the US, there is Indians taking white-collar jobs, which is a very big issue. So how do we, as urban theorists, look at these issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I was slightly alluding to that when I was talking about these false hierarchies that are created, because most migration scholars will critique this idea that there are people who are, forced migrants by virtue of being persecuted and by virtue of being subject to some kind of crisis, whether that be a natural disaster or conflict or violence, and people who are economic migrants who are migrating out of choice and not out of any kind of compulsion. And this is a very problematic division between two different supposedly two different groups of people. How do you begin to separate out, like, is hunger a choice or is it a compulsion? People are migrating to cities from rural areas as landless peasants, as people, you know, who are faced with spiraling costs of commodities, unable to sort of, you know, survive on in those conditions. You know, why do we not talk about them as being forced migrants? And this is something that I have also been quite interested in discussing, because in the field work that I had done, and this has been something that I have I've been probing so much, is that people make those distinctions. Policymakers in cities will make those distinctions. Those people came because they had no choice. They left because of violence. Whereas people who are coming from like rural areas in India, they're coming here because of choice. And well, you know, that's not quite how that works. And you're extending certain privileges to certain groups of people because of episodic violence, rather than thinking about structural issues. And that, for me, is quite problematic. So I think I think most of us as migration scholars would say that is a false distinction. Now, with your white collar question, I'm not sure how I slot that in. I think that question of transnational migration into white collar jobs is something that I haven't really thought about, and it doesn't enter the discussions in the same kinds of ways. So I think you'd have to forgive me if I can't answer that, but I don't, maybe naively, I don't really see that as being an equivalence, although I can see, you know, how they lie in a spectrum, if that helps.
Sorry, yes, we need to move on a little bit. So Eugene, would you like to say your question before I go to you, Faranak? I see your hand.
Hi, Dr. Rocco. Yes, well, look, I'm from South Africa, and I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Yes.
And we have quite a large amount of immigrants here from neighboring countries. I'm talking about Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and so forth. And there is a huge tendency for the local South Africans to be extremely disrespectful towards the people who come to our country purely out of desperation. Okay.
Yes.
We have cases where the local population would burn down shops.
Yes.
You know, where migrants would put up a small shop on a street corner to sell bread and milk to take care of their families, you know. Yes. So I think it's one thing for us to discuss this as academics, while the general population out there are not part of the conversation. So at some point, the general population also needs to be acclimatized to the fact that these people are not here by choice. They are here out of desperation. In South Africa, we have a setup where, it's going to sound funny to you guys, but we have car guards, which means when I go to a shopping center, I park my car and someone looks after my car while I'm in the shopping center. And when I come out, I give the person a few pennies. These people are from Mozambique and so forth. And when I speak to them, you find out they are highly educated individuals many times, professors, architects, engineers, but they are here not by choice, but by desperation. They are performing the most humiliating tasks in order to buy a loaf of bread to feed their kids.
Yes.
But generally speaking, the population as a whole is extremely disrespectful towards them. They are seen as subhuman. They are seen as they're here to steal our jobs, etc., etc. They're also seen as they're here to steal our tax money because the government is paying so much money to take care of these people and so forth. I think that's a very
good point,
important
Eugene.
aspect that needs to be catered for. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I completely agree. And I work quite a lot with many of my South African colleagues. So Professor Landau, who is professor of migration at WITS, is a good friend, and I followed his work for many years. And he writes quite a lot on this issue. And this was why I was saying that education is important. And I think those dialogues need to take place between local communities and displaced populations, because Laurent's point is a valid point, which is he talks about how South Africa includes people in different ways through bureaucratic measures. And this is what he and Caroline talk about as stealth humanitarianism. And I understand that as at a pragmatic level, and I agree with them. But I think, as you were pointing out, that, you know, if we are going to address the bigger structural questions of xenophobia, we need to tackle them through education. There's simply no other way. And people need to be engaged in dialogues with each other as equals. So it's absolutely right that, yes, we can sit here as academics and talk about this, but really the work has to be done on the ground, which is why I was saying that this is political and it's urgent, because it has to be done everywhere.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Farnak, thank you, Jean, for your account as well. Farnak.
Sure. Thank you so much. Let me lower my hand. Thank you so much, Romola. This was so good. And I've been following your work, so it was great to hear you. It's the first time that I hear your presentation. So thanks a lot. And I wanted to resonate or echo with what you presented about these false dichotomies between citizens and non-citizens, or stateless and people who have a state supposedly, and when urban poor is placed against urban poor. And that, as the previous speaker referred to, it's often we see that the poorest against each other. So in a piece that is titled "We Are All Refugees," Efadul Hook and myself, we published it last year in Planning Theory and Practice.
Oh, great.
Try to use it as a way of comparing situation of those who are internally within the city displaced, people who have crossed national borders and have been displaced, as well as, you know, those who have moved or been displaced from rural to urban. So sorts of displacements, from gentrification to others. And they share, you know, when we compare in relation to state, we see that both groups, the stateless and those who have supposedly state, they are all depending on humanitarian assistance, the way that we're talking about, how the governance is happening, how they basically, their practices of citizenship are not much different. So one of the insights coming out of it is, of course, for planning, that has, as a field, is almost always centered on relation to state. It's very state-centered.
Yeah.
Apart from this more recent conversations about insurgent planning, decentering the state and centering citizens in the process, but also looking at the urban movements themselves, you know, just what Eugene was referring to, like Housing Assembly in South Africa, right after xenophobic attacks in 2015, they launched their series of, as you mentioned, educational kind of meetings to extend that with their brothers and sisters, Zimbabweans and other poor, that we are all kind of, you know, in the same boat. So the educational work and call for solidarity by, you know, those movements and organizations that work among the poor is very important message to bridge this. And I'm so enjoyed so much your presentation precisely on that. Thank you so much. Sorry to take so long.
Thank you, Farnak.
Romola, do you want to react?
I do to say thank you very much for those kind words. And also just kind of like, you know, as you were saying that, I was kind of thinking like, you know, I mean, in a way, and something that I've been thinking about since starting my PhD work on this is really like, you know, when do we need to start to call into question what it means to be a citizen? When everybody is sort of marginalized in this way, and deprived in this manner, we need to sort of start to really query what citizenship really means. So I think that's all I would say there.
We need to move on. We are really practically at the end of our Q&A here, but I'll give the word to Charlotte. Scott Frater, would you like to say your question? I can also read it, but.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, hi, I'd be happy to. So my question's about, you referenced humanitarian finance as sort of a primary development engine for urban refugees. And I was just wondering, with sort of the, I guess, snowballing penetration of private financial capital into informal housing and low-income housing globally, like, are those things interacting at all, or are they almost totally separate?
No. It's a great question. And it's a question that actually requires a whole nother talk. But I'm going to try and sum it up in 2 minutes, which is humanitarian finance operates in different ways. So you can have direct sort of aid for providing housing and shelter. Actually, they talk about it as shelter provision in particular ways. But one of the things that some of us had been talking about recently, because we're putting together a conference very soon, is thinking about what the impact of that humanitarian aid is on the housing market in many cities. And one thing that also happens is that the humanitarian aid also works with private finance and private interests. So one of the things that we see is the privatization of shelter and of humanitarianism more generally, not just shelter, but the privatization of humanitarianism. And I obviously study it specifically through shelter provision, where the finance is interacting with private landlords. And there's also incentivization, right? So a lot of the aid that is provided to countries to host displaced people comes through aid packages, which is basically about loans and so forth that will enable refugees to become entrepreneurs, so on and so forth, or take jobs in the private sector and so on. So there are very important synergies. And I think one of my colleagues who has long worked in the humanitarian sector had once said that the mistake that they made during the Syrian crisis was to not engage with the private sector adequately enough. And that led to a lot of missteps in the responses that they had. So like I said, that this calls for a whole separate lecture, which I'm not going to get into. But there's a lot of intersection between the two. So it's a really good question.
Guys, we need to move on. So I will ask Dion if you want to make a very short question and a very short answer as well. I'm not sure he is there or he cannot speak. Dion? Question to Professor Romola. Sorry, I will read because he's not speaking. How do you navigate a sense of hopelessness felt by migrants in the city-making process, knowing that their efforts are only for the benefits of the hosting states and other stakeholders?
I don't think I can give a short answer for this, and I don't think it's appropriate for me to answer this question. I think this is a question that really should be asked to someone who is a migrant, and to ask them, do they in fact feel a sense of hopelessness, and how they go about navigating that. I think I don't want to speak on behalf of somebody else, and I'm not sure whether it would be appropriate for me to suggest ways of navigating that either. But it is an important question to ask, but I think that that's something that could be asked more cautiously to people themselves.
Very good. Puria, we don't have a lot of time. I would just summarize your question very shortly. Puria is asking us about the scarcity of resources discourse. So there is no money for anything. So what do you think about that?
Yes, there's never any money for anything except for the things that you don't really need, isn't it? I mean, it depends on how invested you are in the public, how invested you are in people, and what you see to be society in which you are investing in. So different governments will find different reasons to not invest in them. So I think the whole question of scarcity is, I like with the term disaster or crisis, manufactured. And it's our job to hold governments to account over these issues.
Yeah, it's amazing how money suddenly appears when we have to bail out banks.
Yeah, or if we want to keep migrants away, suddenly there's a lot of money to be given to all these organizations that can help keep the migrants away from Europe.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah.
Romola, on behalf of TU Delft and all the partner universities that helped organize this event, I thank you so very much. I can't think of a better way to finish our workshop. We had a lineup of 4 amazing women, I have to say. It was an all-women panel, thank God, which I love. And each one gave a super nice contribution, and yours was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Romola.
For those who are going to write a manifesto with us, we are going to have a 2-3 minute break, and we are going to come back at 8:10 for the final part of this workshop. So I promise we are not going to stay until 9 o'clock tonight, like the other times. We are going to finish on time, but I'll see you in 4 minutes. For the rest of you who are not delivering a manifesto, thank you so much for participating, and you will hear from us with the publication of the book and so on. Thank you. See you in two minutes.